I think that we need an opposition speech to sum up. Is that the case? Or
Last round of the day, we should be excited. Mr. Speaker, we believe, and we think they accepted what Tate said at the start of the House, that the assumption is that everyone wants the community to become more LGBT friendly. We think that's also their goal at the end of the day, right? We want the world to be more accepting of all these differences. So the question today is what is the way to achieve that? We accept some of their characterizations that right now society is not ready. That some parts of society is not as LGBT friendly as they should be, okay? And we want to achieve those things. So the question is, how do we achieve that? Do we wait for this bottom-up grassroots movement to come from somewhere, this million of invisible army fighting for change within the LGBT community? Or do we take a move? Do we say the time is now and ready, and we take a model of how we protected affirmative action and change for women and do that now for the LGBT community? We think we spent a lot of time at the start of the debate setting up why we need to do this. Tate spoke about barriers of entry that already exist in the status quo, things that keep people out. The change that he's talking about, the individuals that will speak on behalf of these other people, right? President Obama backpedaled from putting gays in the military. There was no opposition to the Defense of Marriage Act as much. He's lost support of the homosexual community. Tate explained that it's against the traditional family values. Someone can't come up and say, I'm homosexual. You have to be a good church-going Christian in order to make it in the political arena. They haven't contended with those issues that should show that this change can happen naturally. NC went on to talk about how the current view in the media biases against that. Their response was, this does not happen. It does happen, is my response to his flippant response. But furthermore, I'd say we gave examples. Think about any role model. A transsexual played in a movie is usually a joke. Think of Fifth Element, right? We put those characters there in order to make fun of those characters. When was the last action hero a homosexual person, Mr. Speaker? It's usually the guy we laugh at, the guy who dies first, along with the token black person in the movie. And those things we say shape those perspectives, and then furthermore entrenched by those moral institutions, right? So what I've done, just with a brief summary of what we've done, we think they haven't engaged the merits of our case on any level, but just asserted that organic change will happen. Based on those assertions, given that they haven't engaged our argumentation, that organic change is not going to happen. And actually, I will take you.
The very fact that steps are being taken for gay rights show that organic change is already happening in support of these gays. So why do you need to suddenly force somebody in?
It would have been nice if you'd given us a string of these steps and told us how this trend is moving towards them and what is pushing those steps to create that change. You haven't. We've shown you, and Tate gave you examples of laws pushed in that pull those steps back. Laws that says it's illegal for a gay man to get married to another gay man. And in fact, turn down those things. In fact, if you talk about freedom of speech and stuff is enough, the Westboro Baptist Church is enjoying the freedom of speech and talking about how, protesting at funerals and saying, well, it's because of homosexuals that God hates fags, right? And that is the trend right now. And how do you expect the homosexual community to defend themselves? You haven't said that. It's just nothing but some hope. So on that side of the house, I hope the speaker can come up and give us some of that trend analysis. Okay, so what I'm going to do, and I think what I've done to a large extent, is compare whether or not that change can or cannot happen. I'm going to address some of the rebuttals that they brought, some of the arguments that they brought in turn to this debate. So first, the last part of what they've been talking about, Mr. Speaker, is firstly, what kind of reaction we're going to get. Are we going to get this negative reaction where people will be humiliated or not? And secondly, whether or not people can do these things because other people can represent them, and so on and so forth, right? So whether or not we'll get the reaction, whether or not we can get what they want. Firstly, on this notion of the reaction that we're going to get is negative. The first speaker talked about how this will humiliate the LGBT community, how it degrades them by connecting them. We think we dealt with some of this already, right? We're not associating them with members of the handicapped community, but we are associating them with the people who receive underrepresentation, like blacks in America who need affirmative action to get into universities. Are you saying that it's insulting to African Americans to give them places in university? Are you saying it's insulting to women in India to say that we need to put them some form of affirmative affirmative action for them to break within the glass ceilings that exist within the fields of legislature. We don't think it's a negative association. In fact, if anything, we want people to know that they do not deserve that representation that exists right now. In regards to whether or not they will be degraded and faced with public scrutiny because the public currently is antagonistic. We say that's not going to happen. The community is varied, Mr. Speaker, and that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is right now, because of the media, because of gay parades, because of the things that receive the most amount of public attention, we think all gays, lesbians, and transsexuals are flamboyant, who like to walk around with big wings and flags on their shoulder. But the community is diverse. We think members of that community for whom a life of career in politics is more appealing to them are the ones who are going to step up to this and will take that position. But even if it doesn't happen, even if they get the more flamboyant ones, right, and the public turns around and says, oh, this is crazy, we think that's cool. We think it gives them a chance to air their views about themselves in the celebrated chamber of legislature, and we think that's what that chamber should represent. Especially when Tate said at the start of his speech that their issues are being discussed. They are getting legislated without representation. And we think that's unfair, Mr. Speaker. That goes against the fundamental creed of the democracy, and that is something that you guys are standing for, and we think that cannot happen. Right? So the impact on whether or not it will humiliate them, whether it will hurt them, we think that's not going to happen. And this thing about forcing people in, we think that's a complete mischaracterization. We're not forcing people in, and they don't have to feel like they're forced in. If people, as it is in the status quo, if they have a candidate that they don't like, they don't vote for that candidate. We're not forcing people to choose these people or to feel that they necessarily represent them. In fact, what our model does is allows people who don't feel like they're ready to vote for that candidate to have these additional candidates to represent a specific mandate. So in a way, it doesn't take away the mandate or the candidates from these other committees. So we think that's great. Finally, this notion that others can represent them, and I've dealt with some of this already, right? But some of the weird stuff that they've been talking about, that you don't need pregnant women. You don't, but you have women who can empathize with pregnant women. And Tate talked about why people don't want to come out and do that. And finally, the weird stuff about, they will create abuse and people will pretend to be homosexual. We think that's just blatantly insulting, right? That you need to put someone to look at someone else's penis in order to know or not. We think you need to trust individuals of this community. You need to trust other people. The same way someone stands up and says, I'm patriotic. How do you know whether that person is or is not patriotic? You let other people choose. Someone gets up and says, I represent homosexuals. And that's what you are doing. You are making it far more risk of abuse, because you say, we'll let politicians now claim that they will support homosexual rights and then we'll trust them. We're going to take it one step further. We're going to ask you to say that you are a homosexual, Mr. Speaker, that you are a transsexual, and therefore we believe only then you will support them. We are very proud to support this piece of legislation.
Thank the government for his speech. To sum up substantive case for the opposition side, I call on the listener.
The picture painted by the government as to the context of this case is rather interesting. They describe gay people as being, or portrayed in the media as being simply flamboyant or, out there, like very colorful, and being society's perception of them being essentially degrading. We don't see this as being the case, and their example of Fifth Sense clearly illustrates that maybe they stopped watching television 10 years ago in that essence, because their views seem to be stuck 10 years ago. But moving on to 3 points of what I'd like to discuss for you today. Firstly, the societal perception and going against the norm of society. Secondly, the perception towards these LGBT people. And thirdly, the role of the legislature and how this fits into the whole puzzle here. So firstly, we've told you about the idea of organic change, and we say that how this actually legitimizes legitimizes these people who are elected if and when they do get elected. We have never claimed that this is essentially necessary. If society deems it to be necessary, so be it. But if society doesn't, fine, we let it be. We think that it's up to society completely to choose what they want to do in this arena. They have already conceded to us that society is not ready. Examples of Prop 8, don't ask, don't tell, and all that. So really, we don't think that that in that context we can actually push forward such legislation. They've also asked us with regard to organic change whether we're going to wait for grassroots movement to rise up and enact this change. We tell you that compared to 10 years ago when they watched Fifth Sense, and now there has been considerable changes, especially in the media. As we've seen, more openly gay pop culture icons, Ellen DeGeneres, T.R. Knight, Elton John, they're all openly gay and proud of it. And we think that necessarily this has all this change, all this perception and change has been achieved without affirmative action. These people have managed to do it on their own. So we don't think that the government needs to necessarily go and back these people by giving them affirmative action to say that you need our backing to go that one step further. You're essentially sending the message that you need us to help you. Because essentially what Mark has already told you, the nature of affirmative action is to help a disadvantaged group. So we're telling you that really, if you're sending that message, essentially, that only the government can help you get there, that you can't do it on your own, we don't think that that fits in with their whole role model example that they put up here. Furthermore, they brought up examples of the Westboro Baptist Church and how that's all celebrated and all that. We tell you there was huge public backlash for this. A lot of people were really not happy with the decision. Sit down. With the decision of the Supreme Court in this instance. So we tell you that society is changing in the example. Furthermore, they brought up the example of blacks and the discrimination against black people. We think that this distinction is quite clear in this instance because in that case they were clearly economically disadvantaged. And therefore, they did need this affirmative action to help them rise up, and educationally in that sense. So we think that in that case, the distinction is pretty clear as to why it was needed, and society was changing in that sense. Whereas with regard to gay people, we don't see that change, although is happening, has not really gone that far yet, as they've already conceded actually in that sense. Before I go on, the taller one.
Are you saying, therefore, you'd be happy to live in a male-dominated society where women have no rights until those males who dominate society decide to give you some?
I probably wouldn't be happy about it, but that doesn't necessarily mean my view overrides the view of the majority. We don't think that is necessary, and until society actually feels that need, we don't think that the government needs to enact any legislation to take any effect here. So furthermore, moving on to my perception of these LGBT people in the community, we've already told you how we think that this essentially hurts the credibility of these people in the legislature who fall under this so-called quota that they want to implement. So you're basically saying, oh, you only got in on the quota, you didn't get in on your merit. It takes away the idea of meritocracy in society, in the sense that you have to earn your way to work your way and earn your place in society rather than just having it given to you on a platter. We don't think that this is sending the right message to either society or even young gay people who would like to have a role in the legislature, because you're essentially telling them you can't get in on your own, you need this quota to get into the government. We don't think that that's sending the right message to these people in that instance. We furthermore tell you that with regard to one moment. Sit down. Yeah. Also, they've also said that only openly gay people essentially can subscribe to this policy. We tell you that this is essentially telling all these people that you have to open yourself up to all the criticism, all the discrimination that they've conceded that exists in society in order to be a part of the legislation and take advantage of this procedure. What they're essentially trying to do is increase the representation of gay people in the legislature, and we think that even if these people are not willing to come out of the closet, they would if they are gay and they are not willing to subject themselves to the scrutiny, we think that they can still be effective representatives of the gay people in the legislature if they were given the chance. But then again, as we've already told you, there's no way to prove whether you're gay or not. So again, that opens up the question of abuse, which they haven't really addressed. Furthermore, we talked to you about the role of the legislature and how the role of the legislature, we think, is to represent what society wants. The role of the legislature is not to take it upon itself to effect change in society. That is overstepping its bounds, we feel. And their mechanism, essentially, they want gay people to be represented in society and all that. But they told you that they want the representation to be 5 to 10%. If you really want to enact gay rights or pro-LGBT bills, how is this 5 to 10% really going to make a difference if in essence, the majority of the other senators, of the other congressmen are essentially against it? We don't think that can bring about the change that they claim that they want to bring. Lastly, we'd like to tell you about They failed to actually tell us how it's only gay people who can empathize with other gay people. We see that even if this representation is needed, we think that people, you, me, even though we might not be of that particular sexual orientation, we think that we can empathize just by the fact that it's another human being that we're talking about. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, we believe that our case is clear and that we take this debate. Thank you.
Thank the opposition leaders for the speech. To call upon, to end the case for opposition side, to call upon opposition reply.
Here.
Now, Mr. Speaker, basically there are two main clashes in today's debate. Number one, on the issue of political representation, and on the second issue, on the issue of the impact to the society. Now, at the end of today's debate, you're going to see why the motion slides with the opposition side. Now, on the issue of political representation, we have seen clearly here that on how the government tried to portray the necessity of the motion, where they claim that these LGBT people need to be represented in parliament for their own interests. So we tell you that this issue here has to go on with the organic change within society itself. I believe I made myself clear on what kind of organic change is this. Well, we tell you that this sort of organic change is about when society is actually ready to accept this kind of people, then the necessity for this motion actually comes. Because when these LGBT people are not accepted earlier on, we see nothing for these LGBT people, and at present we see there are for and against. We see there are certain quotas in parliament, like the Prime Minister has stated about. So we tell you that this kind of organic change is actually going in line with what the society thinks, and we tell you this perception of society must be taken into great consideration in today's debate because it concerns politics. We tell you politics is all about making decisions for your country. We tell you that if the people do not accept these kind of people to be in parliament in the very first place, nevertheless you're going to fix a quota, which means these people will be there nevertheless, then we already shown to you that you are not actually upholding the politics of the society for the very first place, because they are not really represented by the community itself. We made ourselves very clear here from the get-go in my very first speech. We also told to you that yes, these interests of these people need to be taken care of. However, we tell you, you don't really need this kind of people to actually take care of, although there are already people in parliaments that actually being able to take care of their interests. We tell you that you need the society as an overall to really take consideration into the interests of these particular people for you to actually have a change within the society itself. That's why we from the side of opposition goes with the idea of organic change. We tell you, you must have an organic change first to have a political representation in parliament, not the other way around, like what the government's trying to show about. Second level, on the impact to society, right? We tell you, let's see what's coming out from government's case. They told us on two main ideas, on how it affects the LGBT people and on the non-LGBT people. We are already different stages of society now. Now they tell us that once these people actually being elected here, they actually can frame themselves in the media, portray themselves as who they are, and they can use the media influence to actually change people's mind. We tell you, again, in my speech and in the Deputy Leader Opposition speech, that this idea does not go well with the LGBT people in the very first place, because they tell you that they believe that they want the society to accept them for who they are, not because the law states so. We tell you that when you actually do this, you are actually subjecting these kind of people to public scrutiny, which we see is unnecessary, because these people are not really accepted by society in the first place, because we see them as a split between the society on the views of these LGBT people. We tell you that you are actually going to put these people on par with people who are actually mentally unsound and people who are actually lost their bones or ankles or so on and so forth. Because we do not view these people as disadvantaged people, but we just want that this bill will only go on, the necessity for this bill to come when people actually acknowledges and accepts these people within the society. We believe the idea of organic change. We told to you that even when we view society as a whole on the non-LGBT people, right? We tell you they are being very simplistic on the idea, which we believe that you cannot expect these people to change their minds just because they view their successes. We told you again on the idea of organic change that people who are against LGBT people are because they have a different kind of sexual orientation, not because they are incapable. We tell you that this idea that holds firm with people who are non-LGBT people are the main reasons why we tell you we need organic change to actually bring an improvement within our society nowadays. For all these right reasons, I'm very proud to close the case for the opposition. Thank you.
Thank the opposition and partners. To sum up the debate as a whole, I call upon the
Here's why you're going to give the debate to the government, Mr. Speaker. Essentially, let's talk about what each side tried to do in today's debate. Let's talk about this idea of perception of society and tokenism, which is where they really hung their hat in today's debate. This final idea of abuse and verification. And finally, I want to talk about principles. The principles that I started off with, that they never responded to at all throughout all three speakers. Let's talk about what each side tried to do. They got to a bit of a shaky start, and I think the first speaker was confused. That confusion manifested again in the reply when they were saying, we don't want 5 to 10% more over the 5 to 10% we have now. We say, firstly, that's not what we want. There aren't quotas now. We're putting the quotas in place. But inherent in that acceptance that he's going, we don't want 5 to 10% more, is fundamentally an idea that he's going, a lot of his material might also attack the status quo as well. But we accept that that's not the status quo, that there isn't representation now. So let's say what they really consistently probably said about all three speakers, what they wanted. And this idea of organic change. They go, we should stick to existing means. That means we should rely on the very people who are not discriminated against to ensure we're either not discriminated against or discriminating to ensure LGBT people aren't discriminated. Secondly, he said the freedom of speech. And this is where Logan talked about how, Logan and Nancy talked about how in freedom of speech, there's an arena of, there's an arena and a lot of material is coming to that, including the Westboro Methodist Church. We think that this idea that the LGBT community should wait was also a little shifty, because they initially started off, this idea of organic change says that they recognize the positive value in removing discrimination. Yet later on as it went down the line, and I think when asked in a POI and challenge in the last speaker, they kind of went, oh actually, you know what, we don't really care if change happens or not, as long as majority gets what they want. And we say, that's the problem. We don't think that's the way a state should work. We don't think that's the way a state should work in terms of rights. And that's the principles I talked about at the beginning of the speech. The agreement that we set out going, that we do think everyone in society should have equal rights. But let's talk about the perception of society and tokenism. We think this is where they tried to clash with us, and to a large extent the clash was between NC's material and their whole case. Because they start off with this idea of backlash. And and essentially we say, firstly, this idea is on this, it starts off on predicated on being forced to vote. forced to vote for someone whom you otherwise wouldn't want to vote to, or vote out someone who would represent you otherwise. We said the beauty of our model is that it's extra seats. You still get to keep your representation that you have otherwise. You don't lose any, but now you look at someone who represents a specific community. Then they talk about humiliation. This ignores the early parallels I drew in my model, in my speech, in terms of how we're establishing our model in terms of women. But more so, it ignores a lot of the material that NC developed, and he spent a lot of time, and their best response was to say, it ain't so. Right? Because he talked about how it creates role models for the community, but it also creates role models outside the community, people who they can look to and see as credible. Then he talked about this idea of criticism and opprobrium. Essentially, these people will go in there and they will face all this. We say that's a decision any political candidate makes, and you will face that at any point in time. But more importantly, we think they kind of created a catch-22 that they themselves won't resolve. Because they go, we need to change, there needs to be organic change when society is ready. Yet if the very, and this is the POI we asked them, if the very sentiment of society is reflected in law, and law can't be changed without representation there, how do we change anything? Then there's this idea of abuse. Someone's going to go in there and pretend to be gay. We said this was ridiculous, but more so, if society is that discriminatory, under your paradigm, why would anyone want to do this and face that discrimination unless they were actually gay? More than that though, the principles of today's debate. I talked about why it's unfair to disenfranchise a group of people, to make legislation that limits their rights without them having any say in it. This was brought back again by Logan in his own speech and not responded to at all. I talked about why it's not an issue of these candidates not being successful, but there are barriers that come from society, the very thing they considered. No response at all. More so, I pointed out that it's important to have representation in the democracy. How these people need to have a say in their houses of power, in their legislatures. No response at all. For all of those reasons, we win this debate, and we're still proud to propose.
Thank you very much for the debate across the House. Good luck. Great.